The man who lived his entire life, hidden deep in the Appalachian forest away from society. That sentence alone should stop you cold. Because this is not a story about someone who chose to disappear for a weekend or a month or even a year. This is the story of a man who never truly entered the world to begin with. A man who was born in shadow, raised in silence, and who spent the entirety of his 58 years inside the dense, unforgiving wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. Not as a survivalist, not as an adventurer, but simply because the world outside those trees was never made for him. Or perhaps more accurately, he was never made for the world outside. His name was Jedediah Crow, and almost nobody knew he existed. The Appalachian Mountains stretch across 14 states along the eastern spine of the United States, covering more than 1,500 miles from Alabama in the south to Maine in the north. They are ancient mountains, among the oldest on Earth, worn down by hundreds of millions of years into soft, rounded ridges blanketed by hardwood forests, hemlock groves, and river hollows, so deep that sunlight barely reaches the ground at midday. For most Americans, the Appalachians are a place of hiking trails, scenic overlooks, and weekend retreats. For a small number of people, however, people whose families settled those hollows generations ago and never left, the mountains are simply home, a world unto themselves, a world where the laws, customs, and expectations of modern American society feel as foreign and distant as another country entirely. Jedediah Crow came from one of those families. The Crow lineage in the mountains of West Virginia traced back at least 4 generations by the time Jedediah was born in 1966. His family had settled in a remote hollow in the southern part of the state, a place so isolated that it had no official name on any map, referred to only by the nearest creek, a narrow strip of cold mountain water called Harlan's Run. There was no road to the Crow property, there was no electricity, no running water, no telephone. There was a hand-built cabin set back against a hillside, a woodshed, a small cleared patch of earth where root vegetables were grown, and surrounding everything on all sides, for miles and miles in every direction, the ancient, indifferent forest. Jedediah was born into that hollow, and he would spend the next 58 years living and dying within it. But to understand Jedediah Crow, to truly understand who he was and why his story matters, you have to understand what happened to the Crow family long before he was born. You have to understand the choices that were made, the isolation that was embraced, and the biological consequences that followed when generation after generation of a single family folded inward upon itself, cut off from the rest of humanity, reproducing within an ever-narrowing circle of shared blood. Because Jedediah Crow did not simply look different from other men. He was different in ways that went all the way down to the cellular level. And that difference was not an accident. It was the slow, accumulated result of decades of consanguinity, the term used by geneticists and medical professionals to describe reproduction between individuals who share close biological ancestry. In isolated communities throughout history, consanguinity has left behind a distinct and tragic biological signature. It amplifies recessive genetic traits that would otherwise remain dormant. It increases the likelihood of rare disorders. It concentrates physical irregularities across generations until those irregularities become defining features of an entire bloodline. In the case of the Crow family, that biological signature had written itself across Jedediah's body in ways that were impossible to ignore and impossible to misunderstand once you knew the history behind them. He stood at just over 5 feet tall, but his proportions were profoundly uneven. His torso was small and compact, almost compressed, as though the bones of his trunk had been arranged too closely together, giving his upper body a dense, contracted appearance that made him look like a man who had somehow been shortened from the middle. His legs, by contrast, were long and heavy-boned, far out of proportion to his shortened trunk, so that when he walked, he moved with a slow, deliberate rolling gait, his weight shifting from side to side with each step, his body finding its own rhythm, because the conventional rhythm of a proportionally built human frame was simply not available to him. His face told the same story, written in different ink. The asymmetry was the first thing anyone would notice. The left side of his face and the right side of his face did not belong to the same geometry. His left cheek was fuller, rounded outward in a way that pulled the skin tight and smooth over the bone beneath, while his right cheek was smaller, softer, drawn inward, so that in profile he appeared almost to be two different people viewed from two different angles. The deep creases and furrows that lined his face were not simply the marks of age, though he carried those too. They were the marks of a body that had been working harder than it should have had to, compensating for internal irregularities that no amount of outdoor living or mountain air could correct. But it was his eyes that people, on the rare occasions they encountered him, remembered most. His left eye was calm, brown, steady, set deep beneath a heavy brow. It watched the world with a quiet, guarded stillness that some people mistook for hostility and others recognized correctly as pure caution, the wariness of a creature that had learned very early that the world beyond its known territory was not safe. His right eye was something else entirely. It protruded, not slightly, not subtly, but dramatically, pushed forward from its socket in a condition that medical professionals call exophthalmos, a protrusion of the eyeball beyond the normal orbital rim. In Jedediah's case, the condition was severe enough that the right eye appeared to be straining outward, as though something behind it were pressing it forward, as though the space behind his face could no longer contain what it held. The white of that eye was visible all the way around the iris. It caught the light differently than the left eye, more directly, more intensely, so that when Jedediah turned to look at something, the two eyes seemed to be receiving information from different distances, different angles, different worlds. He had lived with that face for 58 years. He had never once seen a doctor about it. He had never once been told the medical terminology for what his body was expressing. He had simply lived inside it, the way a man lives inside any house he has always known, without questioning the walls, without imagining different architecture, because the walls he has always known are the only walls that have ever existed for him. Now check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because this is exactly the kind of story you will never find on mainstream media, told with the depth and respect it deserves, and we bring you one every single week. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what comes next. The hollow where Jedediah lived sat in a part of West Virginia that even most West Virginians had never visited. To reach it on foot, the only way it could be reached, you had to leave the nearest paved road, a two-lane county highway that wound through the hills about 11 miles to the north, and follow a series of old logging tracks and creek beds that gradually became less distinct as you moved deeper into the forest, until the path disappeared entirely and you were navigating by landform alone, by the slope of the hillsides and the sound of running water and the particular quality of silence that deepens as you move away from human settlement. That silence was something Jedediah understood better than almost any living person. He had grown up inside it. His earliest memories, the few that he could access, blurred and indistinct the way all early memories are, like images seen through fogged glass, were of that silence. The sound of wind moving through the upper canopy of the forest, the percussion of rain on a wooden roof. The crack and settle of a fire built from wood he had helped to split with an axe that was too heavy for his child's hands, but that he had used anyway because there was no lighter option, and the cold did not negotiate. His mother had died when he was very young. He could not have said with certainty how young, because the Crow family did not mark time the way the outside world marked it. There were no calendars in the cabin. There were no birthday celebrations, no holidays, no annual rituals that would have allowed a child to construct a reliable internal sense of years passing. There was only the cycle of the seasons, the greening of the forest in spring, the heavy heat of summer, the slow-burning color of autumn, the gray and white silence of winter, repeating endlessly one into the next, without count or ceremony. His mother had been a small woman, already marked by the same physical legacy that would define her son. She had lived her entire life in that hollow too, and before her, her own parents had lived there, and before them, their parents, the generations stacking behind her like pressed leaves, each one thinner and more fragile than the last, as the bloodline narrowed and tightened around itself. She had not survived to see Jedediah grow into adulthood. The specific cause of her passing was never documented. There was no death certificate, no coroner, no hospital record, but the forest floor near the cabin held a small mound of earth that Jedediah visited sometimes, standing beside it in silence, his mismatched eyes looking at the ground with an expression that contained everything that language had never given him the tools to say. His father had been the one who taught him everything he knew about surviving in the Hollow. The man's name had been Elias Crow, and by any measure he was one of the most capable wilderness survivors the Appalachian backcountry had ever produced. Not by training or by choice, but by absolute necessity, the kind of necessity that either breaks a person or shapes them into something extraordinarily competent at the specific task of staying alive. Elias knew the forest the way other men know a city they have lived in for decades. Every trail, every water source, every seasonal pattern of wildlife, every plant that could be eaten, and every plant that would end you if you tried. He passed all of that knowledge to Jedediah with the same unsentimental thoroughness with which the mountain itself had passed it to him. There was little tenderness between them. That is not to say there was cruelty. The record, such as it is, suggests that Elias Crow did not treat his son with anything that could be accurately described as harshness for its own sake. But warmth was not a resource that Elias had in abundance. He was a man shaped entirely by function. He taught Jedediah to hunt because Jedediah needed to hunt to eat. He taught him to build and repair shelter because shelter was the difference between living and not living. He taught him to read the weather in the color of the sky and the behavior of the birds because that knowledge could save your life on the mountain, and ignorance of it could take it. Everything Elias passed on was practical. Everything was about survival. And in that transmission of hard, essential knowledge, there was a kind of love, unspoken, unacknowledged, expressed entirely through competence, that Jedediah would carry with him for the rest of his life. Elias died when Jedediah was in his mid-20s. Again, no record exists. No certificate, no witness, no documentation of any kind. One winter, the old man was alive and moving through the Hollow with the slow, arthritic deliberateness that had replaced his earlier strength. The next spring he was not. Jedediah buried him beside the cabin, near the mound that held his mother, and then he continued living, because the forest did not pause for grief, and neither could he. From that point forward, Jedediah Crow was alone, completely alone. Not in the way that people in cities use the word alone, meaning isolated from their social network, cut off from their usual sources of stimulation and connection. Alone in the most absolute sense. Alone in a way that most human beings alive today cannot genuinely imagine, because we have grown up in a world so saturated with other human presence, voices, faces, the constant ambient evidence of other people existing nearby, that true solitude has become essentially impossible for most of us to access, even when we seek it deliberately. For Jedediah, solitude was simply the condition of existence. There was no one. There had never been anyone except his parents. And they were gone, and the world beyond the Hollow might as well have been the surface of another planet for all the access he had to it, or it had to him. He was, in the most literal sense, invisible to the society that existed 11 miles to the north, and then spread outward from there across the entire country, the entire world. No social security record that anyone could locate. No school enrollment, no medical history, no tax filings, no driver's license, no voter registration, nothing. A man in his 50s living in the mountains of West Virginia, occupying the same hollow where his family had lived for 4 generations, and leaving behind not a single administrative trace in the systems that modern society uses to account for its members. He was a ghost, except that ghosts, by definition, are gone. Jedediah was still there. He still rose before dawn, the way his father had taught him. He still checked the simple snares he set along the creek banks, still read the sky each morning for weather, still split wood and hauled water, and tended the small vegetable patch with the same patient, unhurried attention to necessity that had been his entire education. His body, despite its irregularities, was strong in the ways that mattered for the life he was living. His legs carried him for miles through the forest without complaint. His hands, broad and heavily calloused, could do the work they needed to do. The physical challenges his genetics had given him, the asymmetry, the protruding eye, the compressed torso, the heavy, laboring gait, were simply part of the landscape of his own body, as familiar and unremarkable to him as the slope of the hillside behind the cabin. The outside world, however, saw things differently. The first documented contact between Jedediah Crowe and any representative of the outside world came in the autumn of 2019, when a wildlife survey team from the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources was conducting a population study of black bear in the southern part of the state. The team, 3 biologists working on a grant from the state university, had been moving through the backcountry for several days, placing trail cameras and recording sign along a series of ridges and creek bottoms when they came across something that stopped them completely. A cabin. Hand-built, clearly old, the logs darkened by decades of weather and wood smoke, the roof patched in multiple places with whatever materials had been available at the time of each repair: bark, flattened metal, sections of what appeared to be an old vehicle hood stripped of its paint by the years. A woodshed leaning against one side, stacked to the eaves with split firewood. A small garden plot, harvested down to bare earth in the autumn cold. And signs of current occupation that were unmistakable. Fresh wood chips near the splitting stump, a thin thread of smoke rising from the stone chimney, a pair of boots set outside the door. The team leader, a woman named Dr. Patricia Ames, later described the moment in an interview with a regional newspaper as one of the most disorienting experiences of her professional life. They had been working in that area for 3 days, she said, and had seen no sign of any human presence whatsoever. The cabin had not appeared on any of the maps they were using. There were no trails leading to it that showed any regularity of use from the direction of the county road. It was simply there, a structure that belonged to another era, sitting in a clearing in the forest as though the 20th century had simply forgotten to collect it. They called out. They announced themselves. They waited. And then the door opened, and Jedediah Crowe stepped out. Dr. Ames was careful, in all of her subsequent descriptions of that moment, to be precise and respectful. She was a scientist. She understood, on an intellectual level, what she was likely looking at: the physical presentation of severe multi-generational consanguinity, the accumulated biological expression of a family that had reproduced within an extremely narrow genetic pool across multiple generations. She knew the terminology, she knew the medical context, but nothing in her training had fully prepared her for the reality of standing in a forest clearing in West Virginia in the 21st century and meeting a man who had spent his entire life there, alone, bearing that history in his face and his body, looking at her with one calm brown eye and one eye that seemed to push forward from his face with a kind of urgent, uncontainable intensity. He did not speak at first. He simply looked at them. The 3 biologists and the man who had lived in that hollow for 58 years, standing in the autumn light, with the ancient forest behind them all, and a silence between them that nobody knew quite how to break. It was Jedediah who broke it. He asked them in a voice rough and unused from long periods without speech whether they had come about the bears. Because there were bears in the area, he said. He had been tracking one large male for about a week and a half. It was moving west along the ridge above the creek. If they wanted to find him, they should set their cameras about 300 yards above the second bend in Harlan's Run on the east-facing slope, near a cluster of old chestnut stumps where the mast crop tended to concentrate in October. Dr. Ames said later that she stood there for a moment completely unable to respond. Not because what he had said was strange. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of precise localized wildlife knowledge that backcountry surveys dream of stumbling across. But because the gap between what she had expected, confusion perhaps or suspicion, or the disorientation of a man suddenly confronted with other human beings after years of solitude, and what she received, calm, practical, useful information delivered in the matter-of-fact tone of someone answering a question they had been waiting to be asked, was so large that it took her a moment to cross it. She thanked him. She asked his name. He told her. She asked how long he had been living there. He thought about it for a moment, genuinely calculating, and then said, as far as he could tell, his whole life. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. Jedediah Crowe was not a man without language. He had been raised by a father who, whatever his emotional limitations, was articulate in the specific vocabulary of backcountry survival, and who had spoken to his son about the practical matters of their shared life with a directness and precision that had given Jedediah a functional, if unconventional, relationship with words. He knew the names of things. He could describe what he observed. He could follow a line of reasoning from cause to effect with a clarity that the biologists found remarkable, given the complete absence of any formal education. What he lacked was not intelligence. What he lacked was context, the vast shared framework of cultural reference, social convention, and accumulated information that the rest of society takes for granted because it has been absorbed over years of participation in that society. He did not know who the president was. He had a vague awareness that the country was governed by someone in a distant city, because his father had mentioned it occasionally in the way you might mention a distant weather system. Something real, something that existed, something that had no direct relevance to the immediate problem of staying warm and fed. He did not know what a cell phone was, though he had found one once, years earlier, discarded in the forest by a hiker, and had examined it with curiosity before setting it aside because he could not make it do anything and had no context for what it was supposed to do. He had never been to a hospital. He had never seen a dentist. He had never ridden in a car, taken a bus, flown in an airplane, or used any mechanized form of transportation. He had never eaten at a restaurant, never bought food at a grocery store, never handled paper currency in a transaction of any kind. He had never attended any form of school, never read a book that wasn't one of the 3 worn volumes his father had kept in the cabin, a Bible, a basic field guide to Appalachian plants, and a water-damaged almanac from 1954, and his reading was functional but slow, built on those 3 texts alone. What he had instead was something that no school and no city could have given him. He had 58 years of unbroken, intimate knowledge of a single place. He knew that hollow the way no ecologist or biologist or naturalist ever could, because he had not observed it. He had lived inside it continuously, through every season and every year of his adult life. He knew which sections of the creek froze first and thawed last, and what that told you about the groundwater beneath. He knew which species of trees were declining, and roughly where new growth was establishing itself, and he could describe the pattern of change across the forest canopy over the past 2 decades with a precision that the survey team found genuinely valuable for their research. He knew the individual territories of the deer and the bear and the wild turkey on the surrounding ridges. He knew where the old logging roads used to run before they were reclaimed by the forest, and where the original settlers had built before the Crow family arrived and built again. He was, in the most accurate sense, a living archive of a place that the outside world had entirely forgotten. Dr. Ames and her team returned to the university. They filed their survey report. They mentioned the encounter in an appendix, carefully anonymized. They debated among themselves what their obligations were, to report what they had found to state authorities, to say nothing, to reach out to Jedediah again. The question was not simple. Jedediah Crow was an adult. He had committed no crime. He was living on land that appeared, through the tangled and undocumented history of Appalachian property ownership, to have been in his family's possession for generations. He was not asking for help. He had not expressed any desire to change his circumstances. He was, by every measure that the legal system would care about, a free man making a free choice. But was it a free choice? That question haunted Dr. Ames for months afterward. A man born into an isolation so complete that he had no reference point for any other way of living. Could you truly call his continuation of that isolation a choice? Or was it simply the only life his circumstances had made legible to him? She did not have an answer. Nobody did. The second visit happened the following spring. Dr. Ames returned alone, without the survey equipment, without any official purpose. She brought food, canned goods, dried beans, coffee, a bag of flour, not as charity, she told herself, but as the kind of practical exchange that made sense in the context of backcountry hospitality, where you did not arrive at someone's door empty-handed. Jedediah accepted the food without ceremony and invited her inside. The interior of the cabin was small and meticulously ordered. Everything had a place. Everything was arranged with the unconscious precision of a man who had spent decades refining the organization of a limited space to eliminate unnecessary effort. The tools hung in a specific order, the firewood stacked in a specific pattern, the 3 books placed on a shelf made from a single plank of wood that had been carefully leveled and secured. A single chair sat by the fire, a sleeping platform against the far wall, covered with layered blankets and animal skins, a table made from 2 split logs, a collection of objects that Jedediah had gathered from the forest over the years and arranged along one windowsill, stones of unusual color or shape, the shed antlers of a deer, a section of bark that had been carved into by a woodpecker, in a pattern that Jedediah apparently found visually interesting. That last detail stopped Dr. Ames. She stood looking at the windowsill arrangement for a long moment, and then she looked at Jedediah, and she said quietly that it was beautiful. He looked at the arrangement too, as though seeing it fresh through her eyes, and then he said, without any particular emotion, that he had always noticed things that had a particular shape or a particular quality of light, that the forest was full of such things if you paid attention. That paying attention was, in his experience, the most important thing a person could do. She visited 6 more times over the following 18 months. Each visit followed a similar pattern. She brought supplies, he accepted them without making a point of it. They sat by the fire or walked the hollow together and talked about the forest and the wildlife and gradually other things. She told him about the university where she worked, about the research she was doing, about the city she had grown up in, and the city she lived in now. He listened to all of it with a focused attention that she found both flattering and slightly unnerving, the attention of a person who has no background noise to compete with, for whom every incoming piece of information is signal rather than noise, who processes what he hears without the filtering and partial attention that characterizes most human conversation. He asked questions. Some of them were practical. How did the heating work in a city building? How did you know which food at a grocery store was good to eat? How did a car engine actually function? Some of them were more fundamental. Why did people live so close together? What did they do when they needed to be alone? How did they bear the noise? That last question she found herself returning to long after the conversation was over. How did they bear the noise? He had asked it with genuine curiosity, not judgment, trying to understand something that was for him genuinely incomprehensible. And she found, sitting with the question honestly, that she did not have a fully satisfying answer. People bore the noise because they had always known it, because silence for most modern people was uncomfortable, an absence that the mind rushed to fill, a gap that felt like something missing rather than something present. The idea that silence could be the natural condition and noise the intrusion was not a perspective that most people in the 21st century carried with them. Jedediah carried it, had always carried it. It was the ground beneath everything else he was. If you are still watching this and feeling something move inside you, that is the power of a story like Jedediah's. Drop a comment right now and tell us what you think about a life lived this way. We read every single one. In the winter of 2023, Jedediah's health began to change. Dr. Ames noticed it on her November visit, a slowness in his movements that was different from his usual deliberate pace, a fatigue that seemed to settle into him even during short walks, a thinning of the face that made his asymmetries more pronounced, and his protruding eyes seemed more startling against the new hollowness around it. He did not complain. He would not have known how, in the sense that complaining, expressing suffering with the expectation that someone else would do something about it, was not a mode of communication that his life had ever required or developed. He simply moved through his days at the pace his body now set for him, adjusting as he had always adjusted, without drama and without negotiation. She asked him, carefully, how he was feeling. He considered the question with the same seriousness he gave to all questions about observable phenomena. He said that he was tired in a way that was different from the tiredness after hard work, which he knew and respected. This was a tiredness that sat underneath everything else, he said, a tiredness that the sleep didn't reach. She asked if he would be willing to see a doctor. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that he didn't see what a doctor could tell him, that the winter couldn't tell him more honestly. She didn't push. She understood, in the way you understand things that you cannot change and are not sure you have the right to try to change, that this was not resistance born of ignorance or fear. It was a coherent philosophical position, the position of a man who had spent his entire life reading the natural world as his primary text, who had watched the seasons and the animals and the patterns of the forest, and who understood, as deeply as he understood anything, that there was a natural arc to things and that the arc did not always bend toward more time. She brought food again in January, hiking in through snow that had accumulated to mid-shin depth in the hollows between the ridges. The cabin was warm. The woodshed was full. Jedediah was seated in his chair by the fire, one of the 3 books open on his knee. The Bible, which he had read and reread over the years, not for theology, he had explained to her once, but because it was the book he knew most intimately, and reading its familiar words required less effort than the field guide or the almanac, which still yielded new things when he was well, but demanded more of him when he was not. They talked for 3 hours. He asked her that day about the ocean, whether she had ever seen it, what it was like, whether it was as large as the old almanac described. She told him about the first time she had stood at the edge of the Atlantic, about the scale of it, the way the horizon curved, the sound that was different from any other sound she knew. He listened without speaking, and when she finished he sat quietly for a moment looking at the fire, and then he said that he thought the ocean and the deep forest probably felt the same from the inside. Both of them too large to see the edge of. Both of them older than the things that lived inside them. She thought about that for a long time afterward. In March of 2024, she made the hike to the hollow and found the cabin door standing open. She knew before she reached the threshold what the open door meant. In a life organized around efficiency and conservation of warmth, a door left open in March was not an oversight. It was a punctuation mark, the period at the end of a very long sentence. Jedediah Crow had died sometime in the night. He was in his chair by the fire, which had burned down to cold ash. The Bible was closed on the table beside him. His hands were folded in his lap with a stillness that seemed intentional, though she knew it wasn't. It was simply where they had come to rest. His mismatched eyes were closed, the protruding right eye now indistinguishable beneath its lid from the left. Both of them returned to the same level. The asymmetry resolved at last by the great equalizer. She stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she stepped inside, and she sat in the cold cabin, and she stayed with him for the rest of that day because it seemed to her the only right thing to do, to be present, to bear witness, to give whatever small acknowledgement of a life was within her power to give. Because Jedediah Crow had lived his entire life without acknowledgement from the world that surrounded and ignored him, and she was the only representative of that world who had found him, and it was not enough, but it was what there was. The county was notified. A death record was filed, the first official document bearing the name Jedediah Crow that had ever existed anywhere in any system. He was buried in the hollow, beside the 2 mounds that had always been there. The family reunited under the mountain earth in the way they had been reunited in no other way during their lives. If you have watched this far, and if you are still here, still sitting with this story, still feeling the weight of it, then you already know why this channel exists. Hit that like button right now, because that simple action tells the algorithm that stories like Jedediah's deserve to be heard. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that the most important lives are often the ones that leave the smallest footprint. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because every week we bring you stories exactly like this one. Stories that fall through the cracks of official history, stories about people the world forgot and the places that remembered them. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. There is a question that stays with you after you learn about Jedediah Crow, a question that doesn't resolve itself neatly or quickly. Was his life a tragedy? On one reading, obviously yes. A man born into circumstances he did not choose, shaped by a biological legacy he did not choose, isolated in ways he did not choose, without medical care or education or human connection beyond the narrow world his family occupied. By almost any conventional standard of what a good life requires, Jedediah Crow was denied most of it. But Dr. Ames, who knew him better than anyone and who has thought about this question more carefully than most, offers a different reading. She says that in all of her visits, in all of their conversations, she never once heard Jedediah Crow express a sense that something had been taken from him. He was curious about the outside world, genuinely curious, asking questions with real engagement. But his curiosity was the curiosity of someone encountering interesting new information, not the longing of someone who felt deprived of something they should have had. He did not experience his solitude as loneliness, she says, because loneliness requires a prior experience of connection against which the absence can be measured. He did not experience his hollow as a prison, because a prison is defined by the life that exists outside its walls, and for Jedediah there was no outside, not in any felt sense, not in any way that his inner life had access to. What he had was presence, an almost incomprehensible depth of presence in a single place over a single lifetime, the kind of knowing, of land, of season, of the 10,000 small patterns that accumulate across decades of attentive observation in one spot, that is simply unavailable to people who move through life at modern speed, changing locations and relationships and jobs and contexts in the restless way that contemporary existence demands. He knew one hollow. He knew it the way no one else on earth had ever known it or ever would again. And in that knowing, Dr. Ames believes, there was something that the word poverty cannot adequately describe, and something that the word richness only approximates. She placed a flat stone from Harlan's Run on the mound above him. She doesn't know why, it seemed right. The creek had been the measure of his world, the sound that marked the northern edge of the hollow, the water source that made everything else possible, the constant voice of the landscape he had listened to for 58 years. It seemed right that a piece of it should stay with him. She visits sometimes, not often. The hike is long and the hollow is far and the seasons don't wait. But sometimes in the autumn when the forest goes to color and the air carries that specific cold clarity that the mountains only produce for a few weeks each year, she makes the trip. She sits for a while. She listens to the creek. She pays attention to the particular shape and quality of light in that specific place, the way Jedediah taught her, because paying attention, he told her, was the most important thing a person could do. She believes that. She didn't before she met him. The name Jedediah means beloved. It is a name from the old scriptures, carried across generations by families who kept the old ways, who named their children out of the deep past, who held on to things that the rest of the world had long since set down. Jedediah Crow never knew what his name meant. There was no one to tell him, and the 3 books in the cabin did not include a concordance. He carried the name for 58 years without knowing its meaning, without needing to know, the way he carried everything that was given to him, without question, without resistance, with the quiet and complete acceptance of a man for whom the world was always exactly what it was, never what it should have been. Beloved, hidden in the forest, known by almost no one, known completely by one place. If you made it to the end of this story, then leave a comment right now saying I watched until the end, because I want to know who you are. I want to know who really sat with this story and let it land. And those are exactly the people this channel exists for. Share this video. Like it. Tell someone about Jedediah Crow because he lived his whole life without anyone knowing his name, and the least we can do now is say it. His name was Jedediah Crow. He lived in the hollow above Harlan's Run. He paid attention. That was enough. If you enjoy forgotten stories like this one, subscribe to the channel, because there are still many secrets waiting to be told.